Why hello there. Recently I put out a Wasted Potential on Havoc, and it was covering specifically his appearance in the MKX comic and how I feel that didn't really do the character justice. That episode was made because I wanted to cover the comic. After I did the critique on the MKX comic 2-3 years ago, I wanted to make a Wasted Potential, because that's kind of the way I try to approach things, is Wasted Potential after the main critique. But I didn't really have a solid idea for what to do for the comic. I mentioned that in the episode as well. And I did write part of the script for that, but that's never going to actually get made because it wasn't a particularly solid idea. Fortunately, I have this show in which I can share the idea so you guys can understand what exactly I was going to do. It's nothing substantial, but you might get a kick out of it. So as usual, I'll be looking at the script over here, and then I'll look at the camera when I have something to add that's not in the script. Hopefully there'll be something entertaining out of it. Hello and welcome to Wasted Potential, the show where we discuss the wasted potential of our favourite plotlines. And yes, I know I removed the show from that intro years ago. I don't know why it just came back suddenly, but there you go. And no, it wasn't in the script, I just said that from heart, because I'm like that. I talked at length about the problems with Mortal Kombat X's prequel comic recently. Bad dialogue and continuity, mischaracterization, the usual for MK at this point, right? But what could be done to improve it in a broader sense? Part of the issue, haha, was that the story was a major event that threatened all the realms, but never comes up again, even a few years later, and that it skipped over a bulk of the 2-decade-long time skip. I think a better approach would have been a series of shorts set all across that time span. I would structure it this way. If we're keeping the digital first release, that makes 3 chapters per issue. Thus, we'll focus each issue on a group of characters who will appear in MKX. That's up to 3 shorts to explore that group. Then I left a gap here for the possibility of more context, more rules and such. Issue 1 is naturally about Scorpion, but also Kenshi and Takeda. Chapter 1 centers on the idea that the comic introduced but did little with, that Kenshi helped Hanzo learn to control his rage, similar to his helping Ermac in the old timeline. Chapter 2 has Kenshi leave Takeda with Hanzo while he sets off for revenge, showing Takeda taking the training over time. Chapter 3 sees Takeda become Hanzo's star pupil, while drawing a parallel between Hanzo's ability to let go of his vengeance and Kenshi becoming consumed by his as he continues on his mission. Issue 2 is Sub-Zero's. Chapter 4 is about him taking out Sector, probably with Cyrax taking a morsel blow for him instead of just giving up on life. Yeah, they did that twice, remember? that was vile that they did that twice. Midway Cyrax would be disappointed in his Netherrealm counterparts. Chapter 5 details Sub-Zero rebuilding the Lin Kuei and recruiting Frost. Chapter 6 relates to the alliance with Hanzo and the excommunication of Frost. Issue 3 is the story of the cages. The first chapter details Johnny and Sonya getting together and finding out Sonya is pregnant. And yes, Sonya and Johnny are depicted as being in love, unlike in the real comic, fuck off real comic. The second is their relationship breakdown, culminating in their divorce. Chapter 9 closes the issue with Cassie joining the SF and highlighting how the divorce affected her. Then there's not much for the next couple. Issue 4 follows Kotal. That was all I had. It basically would have been kind of like that one chapter that focuses in the actual comic on the backstories of Kotal and his guys. So this would have been about the rise of Kotal through his interactions with other characters. It would have been about how he won over Reptile, and then Devourer, and God, who else is in his faction? Oh, Aaron Black. We still don't really know anything about how Aaron Black came into his service. He just kind of is there. So that's the kind of stuff that would be explored in the comic. It's kind of weird how Aaron actually doesn't have much to do in the comic, considering he's one of the new guys and name drops Suicide Squad. You'd think he'd have more to do. So that's what Kotal's would have been. I didn't have anything for issue 5. I'm not sure why I picked issue 6 next. Maybe 5 was supposed to be about Melina. So it would be like, well, here's the classic characters, and then we're going to focus on the Outworld stuff, and then start focusing on the smaller stuff. Issue 6 centers on Jax and Jacqui. First we see Jax meeting Vera and give the mother of our new character some actual characterization. Even with MK11, when they killed her off to motivate Jax, she still was not a character. Then we get Cassie and Jacqui together, maybe having a Fight Club adventure like in the real comic. Finally, and that's as far as I wrote for that, I just didn't have an idea for a third part. If I was doing this now, I probably wouldn't structure it the same way. I'd probably just have it be each chapter just is a standalone story that just focuses on various characters, and you're kind of jumping all over the place. I did it this way, I think, for the sake of the issues, where you wouldn't be picking up an issue with 3 random stories, it would be an issue about a certain character. So this issue is Scorpion's, this one is Sub-Zero's. And so it makes sense when you put it that way, but it does mean that maybe it got a little too focused on the minutiae, which I don't necessarily agree with anymore. I mean, I would still like to see it. I'd like to see a bit more about what led to the breakdown of Johnny and Sonya's marriage. There's a lot of stuff I feel should have been focused on somewhere, but just wasn't. 7 and 8 are also not detailed here. Issue 9 is the Shokan issue, telling the story of Goro's war with Kotal, a story about Kintaro, and then Shiva's ascension to Queen, if it must still happen. Yeah, I feel like Kintaro really got the shaft in the Netherrealm era, because Goro was in 2 of those games. One, he wasn't part of the story, but okay. Then he got to have a pretty notable role in the comic. He got an entire bit focused on Goro is a big fucking deal, and like that fight also has long-lasting ramifications that last for about half the comic's run. So Goro was a big deal though. They set up stuff with Shiva becoming queen, which they didn't fully delve into, which is a shame. It would have been cool to actually see the Shokan tournament. And then MK11 obviously did more with that. And even now with MK Onslaught, Goro is in the game. Shiva's part of the story, briefly. And Kintaro just hasn't shown up yet. I wish they would do more with Kintaro, other than just ripping his head off. And then didn't get anything else for issues 10, 11, and 12. Now you may find this structure a little odd, given how I criticised how rushed some of the chapters in the real comic felt. Surely extending those stories out to 2 or 3 chapters would be better. And yeah, it would. But we don't want to go over our 36 chapter limit, just in case DC decides not to renew the series past that. We don't want to leave it feeling unfinished, right? Which I think was supposed to be like a little nod to the fact that the actual comic wasn't finished ultimately, because they were setting stuff up for Season 2. The Season 2 never happened. I think History Behind the Warrior had an interview with Sean Kittleson, where he basically laid out what the plan was for Season 2. Sounded alright, actually. Obviously, there would have been an issue focused on the Black Dragon. Considering Tremor was going to be in Season 1, we probably would have had an entire chapter focused on him. So it would have been his Kano transitioning from working for Shao Kahn to working for Melina. Also, a bit about him fighting the Special Forces, maybe delving into his backstory with Sonya, and something involving Tremor. You know, maybe some other characters like Jarek and Taser could show up, delving a bit into them or their story, so it makes the 2 words up in one. Maybe it would have explained why they're not around. It's genuinely surprising that Jarek doesn't die in the comic. If you were to name like 5 expendable MK characters that you would expect to show up in this thing and die, Suhao, probably Movado, Jarek would certainly be there, probably Mocap as well, and like Dramin, maybe Moloch. They're the kind of characters you would expect to see. Like Jarek just shows up in a couple of scenes and actually manages to survive, whereas Tremor gets shot in the back and presumably dies because he never shows up again. I would probably have had a setup for an issue about Ermac. Given a bit of backstory prior to the flashback with Kotal's coup, why exactly does Ermac switch sides? Because in the game it's a little rushed. For the game it's fine, but it would have been really cool if the comic could have actually delved a bit more into Ermac's thought process. Maybe he could have even had that encounter with Kenshi, who knows? Obviously there would have been stuff focused on the Revenants, but it's another way that they could have given certain characters a bit more screen time. Like imagine if Borai Cho and Li Mei got a bit more screen time. You know, maybe Borai Cho could have been the one to help Li Mei's people escape to Earthrealm. The idea that he did that's why he wasn't around earlier. He was doing that, and then he goes off to the Sky Temple to meet with Raiden and just waits there for a while. While Li Mei's people were heading to Earthrealm, he was the one helping them. And that could have been like an entire chapter dedicated to that. That could have been a really neat thing. It would have been a callback to the 3D era, because this was at a time when it did seem like they were going to maybe be gearing up to some 3D era stuff. I mean, Sean certainly wanted to do some stuff with Onaga, so some stuff about what Quan Chi's been up to in the decades between the 2 time frames. All we know that he did was just fuck off with the Revenants, change clothes, and murder Moloch and Dramin. And he seemed to have been in alliance with Havoc, I think, and that was something, but it's not really delved much into. It's one of the things that's just there to tie the comic's plot into the game plot, because the actual plots are kind of not relevant at all. That's why the amulet is randomly thrown in, just to tie the 2 together. Obviously, Jin would have gotten some focus. That probably would have been where Kung Lao would have gotten some focus. What their relationship is exactly, because it's not really defined in the games. We don't know if the 2 ever met, because we don't know how old Jin is. So maybe Lao was already dead when he was born. Maybe the 2 did know each other. The game's unclear on that. If the comic had gone on long enough, they could have actually started focusing on other DLC stuff, like here's a chapter about Tanya explaining her. Well, she and Rain probably would have gotten one in the Melina issue. It would have been one about Melina, about her rise to the throne, one about her after the coup being helped by the Edenians, probably one that focuses a bit more on the Edenians and what their motivations are. See, this is what I think they could have really done well with this comic to help fill in some of the holes in MKX's actual narrative. Not holes that are like flaws per se, just things that are not explained. They don't strictly need to be, but if you're going to do this prequel comic, it makes sense to answer those questions that fans might have, you know? Like, imagine if the Injustice comic did not tell the story of the 5-year war. It was just one short story. Darkseid, I mean, Darkseid does show up in the comic, admittedly, you know, but imagine that's what happens. He shows up, they put aside their differences and fight him, and then they all just fuck off and no one mentions it again. No one's like, you know, time we put aside our differences to fight Darkseid. Imagine if we could do that again. No, everyone just forgets it happened. And the comic just never explains how Damian killed Dick or any of that stuff. That's what I'm talking about, like how weird it is that the comic doesn't really tie into the game. It wasn't just the Mortal Kombat comic, it was Mortal Kombat X. But it doesn't really address a lot of the stuff that people would want to know about X's story. And this big time skip. Again, it's a 20-year time skip. You could have stories set all across this 20-year time span. Other than the opening, which leads into a few years later, other than that, the whole story takes place in the span of a couple of weeks out of 20 years. And it's such a strange thing. It could have also been really funny if the comic had had stuff with the guests. Like, here's Johnny Cage making a Predator movie. That would be a right nightmare, I'm sure. It's not just WB, NetherRealm, and rights holder. It's WB, NetherRealm, rights holder, and DC. They won't be able to sell the comic after a certain point. Yeah, I just realised the MKX comic is going to still be in print, available for purchase, long after MKX the game is not, because the comic doesn't have the licensing issues. The state of this franchise, right? I'm recording this hours after Chameleon released, and they were like, yeah, how about Chameleon's 6 colour palettes don't include the one she has in the story mode? So you can't use the story mode one, even though her whole story now is being part of the Umgadi. She even does the Umgadi stance like Tanya, and you can't put in the Umgadi. You can't colour coordinate her with Tanya. I don't understand this franchise anymore. It's so stupid. It's so fucking dumb. But if MKX's comic had been more like this suggestion, or like the other suggestion that you can see episode right here, wherever it appears on screen, the franchise would not be quite so dumb. I'm really tired of this franchise. Wow.